as I was saying before, with no further ado, we'll begin this cascade with Dr. Richard Sates from Boston University.
Let's do the clapping again. Very good, thank you. This is going to be, I think, a little bit of alcohol assessment 101. It's a little bit basic, actually. However, I'm going to throw in some challenges and maybe some subtleties along the way. So one way, and we'll get right into it. And also, this is not comprehensive. We're going to focus on some of the things that we've done and decided to focus on after years of figuring out what has the best evidence or is most straightforward. And I think I will not. Something's going on with that. Small earthquake. Okay. So one way to assess alcohol use by self-report is the AUDIT-C, the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test. Consumption items. It's 3 items, as most of you probably know. One of the hard parts about it is that although you might be able to memorize the 3 questions, it's hard to memorize all the response options. So in order to do that in clinical practice, you usually have to write that down or have it computerized so it can calculate a score. For research, though, this is not a particular problem, and you can see what the response options are there. Now, one thing to know about the AUDIT-C, which is on the left-hand side there, right? It's how often you have a drink containing alcohol, how many drinks you have on a typical day, and then how often do you have 6 or more on one occasion. One thing to know about this is that contrary to popular belief, and so this is a little pearl, contrary to popular belief, the purpose of the AUDIT-C questionnaire is not to determine your alcohol consumption. It's not to determine how much you're drinking. It's really to determine whether you're exceeding some threshold, right? Whether you screen positive for unhealthy alcohol use. So many people get bent out of shape about how you could actually screen positive for unhealthy alcohol use, but not be exceeding drinking limits at the time. And you can do that with the AUDIT-C. You can play with this yourself if you look at the questions and figure out how to answer it in a way that gets you a score that meets unhealthy alcohol use, but how you could also not have exceeded risky drinking limits in the past month or so. One simple reason is because this asks about the past year, so you may or may not be doing something in this past month. So there are subtleties in interpretation, but the main issue is that it doesn't tell you how much someone's drinking. It gives you a scalable answer and with a cutoff for whether you have unhealthy alcohol use or not. And at the bottom, you can see the sensitivity and specificity. First, those are data from multiple studies. Around 80% sensitive and around 90% specific for unhealthy alcohol use. By the way, unhealthy alcohol use, as you all know, is risky drinking amounts or alcohol use disorder. It's the whole spectrum from exceeding those amounts to alcohol use disorder. Now, on the right-hand side, this is what we did in Boston Arch, is because the AUDIT-C itself isn't really designed to determine specific drinking cutoffs, as I've described, we wanted to have a little bit of additional data. So in addition to asking how often do you have 6 or more drinks, we also asked how often do you have 5 or more drinks and 4 or more drinks for women, because those would be sort of direct questioning of the risky, heavy episodic drinking amounts. So we have those data as well. For the AUDIT-C that's on the left-hand side, what's been validated is probably the best cutoffs are scores of 3 or more for women and 4 or more for men. And if you have a score of 7 to 10, that suggests a moderate to severe disorder, the disorder formerly known as dependence. And then the last thing I'll say is specific to HIV, that is that the AUDIT-C has been tested in people with HIV infection, and at least in one paper with a large data set, McGinnis and colleagues, that's VAX folks at Yale, in collaboration with us and others, you found the cutoff to be 3+, the best cutoff to be 3+, which is the cutoff for women in the general population. This cutoff for men and women with HIV infection was 70% sensitive and 81% specific. And of course, for research purposes, if you want to alter the sensitivity and specificity, you can do so just by increasing or decreasing the cutoff, and one will go down, the other will go up. Todd Korthuis and Amy Justice have a couple papers, this is the bottom of the slide, that at a cutoff of 4 or more in HIV infection, that was associated with worse quality of care, that's Todd's paper, and mortality, that's Amy Justice's paper. So that may be almost all I want to say about the Audit C. The Audit C presumes that you're talking about these standard drink sizes, and so we show people this, and oftentimes people have standard drinks that are not looking like this, but this is a start. And we use this also for when we do the timeline follow back. And then after the Audit C, if you want more information, more detailed information, besides, so the Audit C, a score of 7 to 10, or of 7 to 10 is related to moderate to severe disorder, or formally dependence, but that's based entirely on consumption. If you want to get a fuller picture, but still using a screening test, you could use these cutoffs for the audit. The full audit is 10 items, so it adds 7 more items to the 3 consumption items. And here's another little pearl. Contrary to popular belief, if you're using the full audit for screening, the cutoffs, here's what they are not. 8. 8 is not the cutoff for the audit. So for all of you who've read that it's 8, you probably read it in the manual for the audit produced by the WHO. For many reasons, well actually just from data itself, in Aaron Johnson and Dan Vinson and Paul Seal wrote this paper some years, about five years ago in ACER, looking at a bunch of data sets to find the best cutoffs for the full audit. And for the full audit, the cutoff for unhealthy alcohol use is 5 for men and 3 for women. If you want a cutoff for dependence where you detect enough cases of dependence, that is, it's sensitive enough to be meaningful, you want reasonably low cutoffs, 6 and 4, which are even lower than the WHO's recommended 8, right? If you want to use the audit, however, like maybe you want to use it after the Audit C to get an idea of whether dependence is in fact there, you might want to use a higher cutoff. So for those with scores of 13 to 15 or higher on the right-hand side of this table, that's more consistent with, much more consistent with dependence. And it would give you close to 100%. Actually, in that paper, it gave you 100% specificity. Then the next question, we figured in ARCH, and in any study we do for NIAAA, frankly, we want to have a measure of alcohol use disorder. And it could be using a screening test where you approximate, say, well, maybe, likely the person has alcohol use disorder based on a screening test. But for most of these studies, especially if you're giving a medication or if you really want to know, we want a gold standard. Now, you would think that after decades and decades of alcohol use disorder related research out there, that there would be an easy way to diagnose alcohol use disorder so we all know what we're talking about and that we're all talking about the same condition. And we came up against some challenges there. Not only the fact that DSM-4 switched to DSM-5, that we can handle. We had been using the DSM-4 version of the mini International Neuropsych Interview, to get current alcohol use disorder according to DSM. And what happened between the first 5 years of doing ARCH and the second 5 years is either they started charging a fee or we found out that you are supposed to pay a fee. One of those two things happened, I think. And it's a per administration fee. So and it used to be that you could do it on paper for free, but if you did it electronically, you had to pay. Now you're supposed to pay regardless of how you use it. And we decided that that was not a good use of our funds and decided not to use that. That's the top left box. And then we considered, NIAAA's website has the DSM criteria made into questions. So if a criterion is use despite recurrent consequences, the question would be something like, have you been using with recurrent consequences? And so they have those on the NIAAA website. No, it's true. We can show you. Then there's, on the bottom right, and by the way, those questions are not validated, but you could use them either as a checklist, which some people have done in studies, not validated, or you could use them as an interview, also not validated. So we said we're not going to use the top left mini because we don't want to pay. The bottom is NIAAA questions. The bottom right is the Audatus, the alcohol use disorders something interview, something schedule, something like that. The Audatus is what's used in NESARC, the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol-Related Conditions, to determine the prevalence of alcohol use disorder in the U.S. So it's been well vetted and validated. It's a lot of questions because it doesn't only ask the criteria, it asks a lot of questions to get at the criteria. Oh, it's right there. I could have just read it, Kendall. Associated Disabilities Interview Schedule.
Right,
there it is.
Right,
so we right, that's right. Nobody knows it.
No one knows.
So we looked at those three: the top left box, the bottom left box, the bottom right box, and then we considered the SCID, the Structured Clinical Interview for DSM. The SCID is supposed to require a master's level person to administer it, who's trained specifically in doing that clinical interview to make a diagnosis. On Boston Arch, we don't have clinicians doing these assessments, and we want to be able to do it without having to train clinicians to do these assessments. So we want something that could be an interview. So those are the 4 places that we looked, and we really couldn't find a well-validated, relatively brief way to diagnose alcohol use disorder. And I asked around at NIAAA. I asked a bunch of people at NIAAA. They emailed colleagues and researchers, and frankly, I find it shocking. It's kind of shocking that there's just not a, it's not out there. It's not NIAAA's fault. I'm just saying that, we asked around, and there's not something out there off the shelf to diagnose the thing around which there's an entire institute, and that we're doing all these studies. So we created our own assessment drawing on these, and I'm going to show you I'm going to show you an example of what we did. So all you have to look at is this middle orange row. That's one of the 11 criteria for DSM-5 alcohol use disorder. So there's 11 criteria, and I've got the 11 criteria on these 3 slides, but I'm just going to show you the example for what we did with one criteria to change it, to turn it into a question. So the criterion is on the left: persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down. Well, how do you determine if the participant has that? Well, you could go all the way over to the right-hand side. The Audatus asks these 2 questions: more than once want to stop, more than once try to stop. The SCID asks a question: have you tried to cut down or stop drinking? And then you listen to the answer and you explore and then determine with your clinical expertise whether they meet the criteria or not. The NIAAA operationalized question, that's sort of a checklist on their website, is more than once wanted to cut down or stop drinking, tried but couldn't. And then the mini question, which was from an interview done by trained research staff but not clinicians: have you tried to reduce or stop drinking alcohol but failed? What we ended up, so we went through all of those and then decided, well, what would be the best? And we came up with these 2 on the left. And I know that they look similar to others, but for each one of these, we did this process to make sure that we were capturing with both sensitivity and specificity. And this was our own creation of a best bet to try to meld a clinical interview like the SCID, but to make it be with questions that we could use in an interview that someone could fill out a checkbox and say, did you more than once try to drink less or stop drinking but couldn't? Did you more than once want to drink less? So it captured both the try and the want, just like the Audatus does in this case. We did that for each criterion. To come up with our own, this left-hand column, question for 4F to determine the DSM criteria. I promised I would not go over this, but we spent a lot of time doing this. And what we haven't done yet is validated it, but these other approaches, several of them are not validated either, and we were hoping to get sort of a happy medium, and they have, I think, face validity in that they're similar to some of these others. I'm going to make just a couple other quick comments before going to a demonstration. The U.S. audit. I put this up here just in case anyone has anyone seen the U.S. audit, heard of it? Oh, good. This is great. Don't use the U.S. audit. So now I've actually let it out of the bag. So the U.S. audit comes out of the CDC, and it's not a terrible idea, but it's not validated. And this idea came out of folks kind of frustrated with the audit and the audit C not being perfectly correlated with risky drinking amounts. And they said, well, we need something for the US that perfectly correlates. And so they made more response options and changed the third question of the audit so that it would be 5 or more or 4 or more drinks instead of 6 or more, which is the international version. The international version, despite the 6 or more, has been validated perfectly well in the US. Thank you very much. This one maybe comes closer to being exactly what you're drinking, but it's still not going to do it because it is over the past year. It's just an approximation. There's no real need for it, and it's not been validated, so I would not encourage you to use that. And I guess this just shows the differences are really in the audit C. The U.S. audit is above, the U.S. And the audit C is below, but since you're not going to use it and haven't heard of it, that's great. Let's just keep it that way. Okay. Next, we're going to do, so that's just some self-report measures. We're going to get to a more gold standard self-report measure in a moment. But one thing we do, you guys want to prep, or am I talking some more? Talk some more?
Yeah.
I should talk some more. Okay, so one thing we do for each interview is we do check breath alcohol concentration. And this slide just reminds people that, that there are symptoms correlated with, or impairments correlated with different levels of blood alcohol concentration on the left, this assumes actually no tolerance yet. And then you can see on the right-hand side the what is famously known by medical students as the zero-order elimination, because the elimination curve is the same regardless of how much, the slope of the curve is the same regardless of how much alcohol you have on board. That's like from Pharmacology 101. And so we check this. We check it for a variety of reasons. One is if we check it, we think maybe it will help people tell us more truth when they report on their drinking because they think we're testing something, which we are. It also helps us give us an inkling about interviewing participants who may have been recently drinking, and then we record those results. Now, are you guys coming? Okay, good. So we're going to demonstrate a couple things. Are you going to talk about this too?
Yes.
Perfect. So we're going to demonstrate a couple things. Breath alcohol, and then also some of the more complicated interviews, which we will not show you the whole interview, but just pieces of them so you get an idea. So I think you have to use the mic.
Yeah, you would have been good.
So this is Jasmine and Zan. This is Zan, and this is Jasmine. Say hi.
Are they allowed to drink?
They are.
Yeah, some things, yeah.
I know.
Right, so my name is Zan. I'm a research assistant on the study. And at the beginning of every assessment that we do, the RAs conduct a breath alcohol test to the participants. So if the breath alcohol concentration is reading positive, visits will still take place unless the participant's too intoxicated to complete the visit. However, if clinically intoxicated or if the breath alcohol concentration is above 0.08%, and the participant drove to the visit, we will advise them not to drive themselves home from the visit. So we ensure confidentiality with the participant by stating that the results of the test are confidential and we will not share them with their doctor, and it will not affect their ability to be in the research study. And so now we're going to actually demonstrate using the breathalyzer. So I do need one volunteer, if anyone can volunteer.
Say one didn't treat you.
I'm going to pick someone and show us. All right, perfect. Thank you.
Good job. Oh, there you go.
You gonna volunteer for the PET test too?
Yes. So we have two options. You can either drink some kombucha or rinse with mouthwash. Or you can, if you really don't want to do either, you cannot do it, but it might be
I was
helpful.
gonna have the shot of vodka, whichever.
Which one's your preferred?
I don't care.
Okay. Mouthwash?
Sure.
All right.
I'll have dental health hands.
Okay, so there's some mouthwash.
have some.
And then another cup for you as well.
Or you can switch back out that one.
Good job.
Perfect, yeah, thank you. And then we begin the breathalyzer by reading them a script. So we say, in a second, I'm gonna have you take a deep breath in, hold it for a moment, and then blow continuously through this mouthpiece, and keep going until I tell you to stop. Blow as if you're blowing out candles on a birthday cake, all right? So I'm gonna turn this on.
Lots of candles or a few candles?
Lots of candles, keep going. All right, so deep breath in, and then go ahead, blow. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. All right, perfect, all set. And then it'll blink and it'll tell me 0.297. So we would definitely advise not to drive home.
Wow.
What you had this morning?
With green, I guess.
That's impressive.
That is incredible.
See?
Okay, so another tool to assess alcohol consumption behavior is to take lifetime drinking history. So this assessment is a structured interview that provides quantitative alcohol measurement from the onset of regular drinking. Basically, the lifetime drinking history, what it does, it assesses, it includes quantity, frequency, variability, and types of beverages and life events related to drinking. And it begins with collecting the earliest age a participant began drinking with at least more than one drink per month. And so the data collected from the lifetime drinking history is calculated in alcohol consumption of kilogram per year, and it also includes years of heavy drinking days. So in the past, we have collected the lifetime drinking history for this cohort.
So now we're going to talk about timeline followback. Timeline followback is a validated tool that is used to assess alcohol use by self-reporting. So in 4F assessment, we calculate, which is the assessment we're currently doing, we calculate the past 14 days of consumption. So in HIV studies, 14 days is a better approximation of past 30 days drinking than is calculating past 7 days. So in one study by Phelan et al. In 2013, they found that 14-day timeline followback assessment was 81% sensitive compared to 66% sensitivity, and which was in the 7-day assessment. And then 14-day assessment has a 0.94 Spearman's correlation coefficient, whereas 7 days has a 0.86 Spearman correlation coefficient when compared to the 30-day calculation. So timeline followback collects information of variability, pattern, and extent of drinking, and we ask questions about any drinks per day and number of heavy drinking days. So as Rich talked about earlier, heavy drinking days for a woman would be greater than or equal to 3 drinks and greater than or equal to 4 drinks for a man. So first we orient participants to the timeline followback, and we tell them, I know it may be difficult to remember what and when you drank over the past 14 days, but please do the best you can. We'll work through it together. And then we clarify the range of dates by showing them a paper calendar with the dates circled on it, and it's marked pretty clearly. And then we show them the standard drink sizes that Rich showed you before, and that helps prime their memory recall. And anchors are another helpful tool to prime memory recall. So we provide a provision of important dates shown on the calendar, such as holidays and weekends. And then we establish different anchors with participants, such as life events and routine habits like birthdays, employment, illness, travel, childcare, etc. So we're now going to demonstrate timeline followback.
Okay, so another interactive exercise for you guys. So this is a calendar we show to our participants. So in this demonstration, Zan's gonna be the research study assistant, I'll be the participant, and we can just kind of show you what we do in the study. So first, so here's an example of a calendar that we do show to our participant. We'll first build information of RA's research study assistant's initial on top, as you can see on that top corner right there, and the study ID, and also the participant's assessment type, which is a baseline for this one, and the date. And so for this exercise, we're going to say that today's date is April 24th. And then we'll mark the range of dates that we are we're questioning, which is 14 days, starting from yesterday. So we're gonna mark April 10th all the way to 23rd. And so this is just to ground us in terms of priming memory recalls for our participants. And so you'll notice that in our calendar we'll also include holidays such as Patriots Day, Passover, and Easter Sunday, and that kind of just helps participants remember certain dates. Okay, so we'll demonstrate. We'll talk loud.
All right. So, Jasmine, these next questions will ask about your use of alcohol over the last 14 days. So, looking at this calendar, the time period I'm referring to is between April 10th and April 23rd, which was yesterday. So I know it may be difficult to remember what and when you drink over the last 14 days, but please do the best you can. We're going to work through this together. So have you had any alcohol to drink in the past 14 days?
I usually drink whiskey, rum, I guess sometimes beer.
Okay, thank you. And what kind of beer do you usually drink?
Natty Daddy.
All right, thank you for that information. So looking at this calendar, are there any days where you typically drink more or less than you usually do?
I drink pretty regularly, but I guess I don't drink on Sunday because I go to church. I don't drink on Friday because I have my grandchildren over. I don't drink on Monday because I have a part-time job.
Okay, thank you. And I noticed that you mentioned you work on Monday and you don't drink, but the April 15th was Patriots Day, which is a holiday. So did you have anything to drink? Was that day any different?
Yeah, I definitely drank. I drank with my coworkers afterward, so I guess I forgot, yeah.
Okay.
I drank that day.
All right, thank you. So we would take that information and mark down the days where Jasmine noted she did not have anything to drink. All right, so looking at this calendar, starting from yesterday, the 23rd, did you have anything to drink on the 23rd?
Yeah, I drank yesterday. I drank this beer.
Okay. Was it the Natty Daddy that you mentioned
Yeah.
you drank? Okay. And what size was the can?
24 ounce.
All right. Thank you. So we would continue to do this for all of the days on the calendar, and here you can see an example of a completed calendar this is what it would look like after the assessment's finished.
And you'll notice that this person, I guess me in this case, usually drinks beer and also sometimes rum and nip of whiskey. Okay, so with this calculation, we can now actually calculate the standard drinks per day. So we'll use the calculation, as you can see on the right side. We need number of drinks, we also need sizes in ounces, and also alcohol percentage. And then that will get us to the number of standard drinks consumed. And so these are the calculations. 003 will be the standard drinks that this person has consumed. And so it's really important for us to gather all the data, all the details as much as we can get, because it's going to help us actually calculate these data. It's also important to note that the sizes and percentage really vary widely. So that's why in the assessment in the field, we ask a lot of follow-up questions regarding the alcohol drinks. Okay.
I think so, yeah. Or, yeah, I don't know if you want questions, we can. Do you want to, yeah, go ahead.
I have two. The first one was, how do you make sure that you don't end up just replicating the mini in the format?
So the question is, how do we make sure we're not replicating the mini?
Right. Or, I mean, because that sounds like if you do that, you have to pay for it.
Yeah, I mean, we considered that as a strategy. Yeah, I mean, all the questions are quite similar. No, I mean, we just wanted to be honest that we're not using the exact mini, but of course we're using criteria. So it's really about how we adapted the questions slightly to make them more efficient and make sure that we were capturing what we think are the concepts, balancing not just having a check of 11 items, which is probably insensitive because there's different ways of getting at a criterion, but also not asking 5 different questions about one criterion because that just is too much.
And the second one?
Yeah.
That was a really great presentation. I loved it. It was really helpful.
He loves the presentation
I really
on
do.
BAC.
So I understand why 14 versus 7. Why 14 versus 30? 30 is timeline follow back.
Yeah, no, so, okay, so the question is how many days should you do the timeline follow back for? And, you know, the original development and validation of the timeline follow back was in college students, where all good alcohol research is initially done because they have psychology students at the ready. And they validated it for 365 days. And the reason that it's valid, so there's a lot, when you think about validity, what does validity mean? Well, it means accuracy, reliability. There's lots of different ways of measuring validity. And in that case, they were mostly talking about test, retest. So reliability, essentially. It doesn't mean that for sure this person on August 23rd had 5 drinks. But in general, it's pretty good for saying that on average or during that month, or they had X number of heavy drinking episodes, and that's what its reliability is. Most people from most studies have taken it to 90 days, down to 90 days, and that allows you to have continuous data if you have every 3-month interviews. But 90 days does take a long time to do, and how long, Zan, does the 14-day take to do, usually, on average, Jasmine?
30 minutes.
About 30 minutes.
That's if
So what you saw them doing, this was just a snippet. It can take up to maybe up to 30 minutes. I don't know if that's average. Let's say up to 30 minutes to do the 14-day timeline follow back. People have also done it online, which I think you may hear about very soon, and that may be quicker. And we'll hear about its validity and its accuracy as well, I'm sure. But so people have then taken it down to 30 days to make it more manageable. And then the folks at Yale did this comparison, can we squeeze it down a little bit more in 14, which we did. Okay, thanks everybody.
All right, now we have Tyler Ray from Brown University.
Morning, everybody, or afternoon, not sure which it is at this point. So I'm Tyler Ray, I'm with the Brown Arch. Carly and Jeff asked me to come up today to tell you a little bit about some technology-facilitated methods for assessing alcohol use. And in fact, as Rich mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about an online timeline follow-back too. So I'm going to focus in particular on some things we like to call intensive longitudinal methods. So things like ecological momentary assessment, daily diaries, even weekly or bi-weekly diaries we'll talk a little bit about. So, let's kind of get going here. So mine will be a lot shorter than the last one. So kind of 2 key issues I think are important to think about when we talk about using intensive longitudinal methods. One is accuracy. Kind of the key goal here in sort of parsing out people's experience, focusing on sort of the day level or narrower increments of time is really to improve accuracy. So 2 issues are important here to think about. One is that the issue of recall bias is important. So oftentimes it's really hard for people to remember what their experience was like in the past, and so that's kind of important to think about. Often the questions we ask too are overly broad. So for example, one popular question that's included in the audit C, you'll remember, is something like, over the past 6 months, on average, how much did you drink in a given week, or something like that. If we're recalling things that happen up to 6 months in the past, it's often really difficult for people to remember that. There's also kind of this mental math thing that we're requiring people to do in sort of aggregating their experience over time. So if we're talking about a broad interval like 6 months, oftentimes it's, that drinking fluctuates over time, right? And so it's often really difficult to sort of give people a picture of, on average, how much we're drinking over that time. So another reason to choose methods like these is when you really need a lot of detail, not only about what happened, but maybe exactly when. So it's also true that we might want to assess things that really can't be assessed very well after the fact. So things like mood, maybe we're asking a lot about people's reasons for drinking, and that's often really difficult to recall at any interval. So using the internet and smartphones can make it a bit easier for participants to respond quickly and go about their lives. So rather than having them come in for visits and peppering them with questions for an hour, we can assess a lot of pretty detailed things quickly and easily using these methods. And so that's kind of the high resolution part. In fact, it's often so easy to assess things in this way. I think one thing that we need to sort of be aware of is, sort of when using intensive methods like these, how do we do it in a way that avoids burdening participants so much so that the method itself sort of leads to inaccuracy. So, people often get sort of, or have a tendency to get fatigued or sort of sick of responding. So, that might be cases in which they'll sort of start ignoring or speeding through our questions, and so that's kind of an issue. So that's where the kind of low touch part sort of comes in. So the low touch part might also be especially important in studies where we're really interested in sort of just observing what's going on without bugging people a whole lot. So for example, in a recent study of PrEP adherence that we recently finished up, we wanted to study daily alcohol use in detail. But we didn't want to be contacting participants every day just because that can sort of lead them to remind them to take their medications, right? So that sort of defeats the purpose. So the first method that I'll talk about we used in this study. It's actually an online timeline follow-back. And this study was recently published in JADE. So feel free to read more about it there. So the method that we used was, like I mentioned, an online timeline follow-back that we built basically in a web app that's essentially basically more versatile than some of the online timeline follow-back tools that we've seen. We built it specifically to be used in longitudinal research, which I think is an advantage here. So the highlights, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that just because you can actually read more about this in our papers. But the highlights here are basically just that you can set up your own studies, select a specific recall, interval that you're interested in. So 30 days, 2 weeks, 1 week, whatever you happen to be interested in. You can also set up custom behaviors that you want to assess. So like, essentially whatever behavior you can think of that would be useful to assess via timeline fallback, you can assess this way. Then when participants log in, they basically are shown a calendar of whatever recall window you specified, and then it asks them to mark the days on which they engaged in each of the specific behaviors that you ask about, and then those days are marked with a specific sticker that you can choose. And then once they've identified all the days for all the sort of things you're interested in tracking, it takes them to a detailed view where you can sort of ask more specific questions about behaviors that happened on that day. The advantages of this, there's a lot more sort of features that we built into, but the moral is that we like using this in longitudinal research. It makes things quite a bit easier. Also just want to sort of make a plug too. This is actually available for anyone to use, so if this is something you could use in your research, feel free to just reach out to me. And we can get you set up with an account and sort of teach you a little bit how to use it. So there's also more info though here at that URL that's at the top where you can sort of see videos about how to use it. There's also a manual and so on that might be helpful. So in the PrEP study that I just talked about, we actually use this tool in bi-monthly increments. So people would log in every 2 weeks basically and tell us about their sexual behavior, their drinking, their drug use, and so on. And basically in this study, we enrolled high-risk gay-bi men who were on PrEP to use an internet-connected pill bottle over a 6-month period. And then during that time, they just did their normal sort of routine of clinical follow-ups. And then they logged into this every 2 weeks to sort of give us that timeline of behavior. So in that 3-month visits, we also took dried blood spots and analyzed it for PEP as well. So this is what it looks like when we plot people's PEP values here on the y-axis. I have a pointer, so sorry, but it's on the y-axis there. Or I'm sorry, yeah, y-axis, and then the bi-monthly timeline follow-back in the 2 weeks prior to their follow-up visit where we collected dried blood spots is listed there on the x-axis. The dotted line represents what would be perfect agreement, and the solid one is just a sort of linear best fit line. So basically it looks like this kind of bi-monthly assessment approach and using the timeline is pretty consistent, and it sort of maps well on PEP as a biomarker overall. Sometimes though you need even more detailed data than that. So let's say you want to understand what's happening on a daily or even an hourly basis. So another set of methods that could be useful for this are what's called ecological momentary assessment. EMA just really refers to kind of a family of methods that involves any combination of intensive longitudinal methods, so typically focused though at the day level or smaller increments of time. So this would include things like daily diaries, experience sampling, even event contingent assessments. And so these might be really useful for studying things that change a lot hour by hour and that we really need to collect around the time when they happen. So for example, if we wanted to assess drinking within 24 hours, because generally it's quite a bit easier for people to remember what happened when it's the next day, we could ask them that through a daily diary survey. If we wanted to know what reasons people have for drinking when they drank on specific days, we need to know that really when people start drinking, and assessing that at any recall is going to be really tough and probably not so accurate. So in that case, we could have them do an event contingent survey around the time when they start drinking on a given day. Or finally, if we wanted to assess people's moods throughout the day and how that affects their drinking, for example, then we really can't assess that accurately at any recall at all. Plus, it's also pretty dynamic, meaning that it changes pretty quickly. So in that case, we might sort of assess things like mood randomly over the course of each day and sort of samples of people's experience over that time. So EMA basically refers to all these methods used in some combination in order to sort of approach each of the sort of constructs that you're trying to assess in the most sort of valid way. So basically that's what we did in a study of 100 gay bi men. This is actually funded by a supplement to our existing PO1. That's the brown arch. And so basically we had 100 high-risk gay bi men who were also heavy drinkers do a study just like this for 30 days. So they downloaded an app onto their smartphones basically and then used this app to collect several of these types of surveys that I just talked about over the day, over the course of each day during that time. And I'll sort of spare you the details here, but basically these are actually in published papers already, but the timeline down there below is kind of the pattern each day that people would follow. So they did a daily diary assessment in the morning each day. Sorry, I'm shaking it there. And then random assessments throughout the course of each day, and then when they started to drink on a given day, they would do an event contingent assessment whenever that happens. So obviously one of the big advantages of this approach is that we can assess alcohol within 24 hours, right? So at least some pretty good data, I think, on the topic. And so one of the things we were curious about was how much this approach might help us improve the accuracy of assessing things like alcohol use over, say, that a 30-day timeline follow-back type of approach, right? So 30-day timeline follow-back is a pretty popular assessment approach, one that's used pretty often. We use it in our own longitudinal studies a lot. So we wanted to know, how much better can EMA data do over this? So this plot basically shows you the total number of drinks that people reported over that 30-day period on both axes, but the EMA data is there on the y-axis, you can see there, and then the timeline follow-back data is on the x. So the dotted line again represents perfect agreement, and then the solid line would be it's a linear best fit line. So there's quite a bit of scatter here, obviously, but in general, fairly decent agreement across these two different methods. But if we accept that EMA methods are probably a little bit closer to the truth, this kind of shows that 30-day timeline follow-back methods are generally pretty good on the whole. In fact, the root mean squared error here was about 5.5, so not awful on the whole. But since there's a pretty big cluster, you can see up above that dotted line, A, most values are above that dotted line, but B, they're all sort of clustered around where that reference line is. Essentially that tells you that people are generally probably underreporting on the timeline followback versus EMA methods. So if we use EMA methods, it might get a little bit more sort of closer to the truth where that's concerned, as long as we ask them as soon as we possibly can after that happens. So That's basically it. I have a huge group to thank, of course, and big thanks to NIAAA for their support. Thanks for the invite.
Just time for one or two questions? Linda?
I just have a comment on the recall bias.
Yeah.
And this actually is relevant to the last talk as well, when you prompt the, I guess, the participant to recall, like, there was an event in Boston, and so the comment was, well, did you drink on that day? Because we had, I don't know what, is that, so how do you account for that in your analysis? Because you're kind of, they don't remember, but you're saying, well, did you do this on this day because this event was occurring?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one thing to sort of wonder whether or not that event prompted more drinking or whether they're just drinking a lot on that day. And typically, we're interested in much more in the latter question than sort of whether or not an event influenced that. I mean, sometimes we might be interested in that question, but not always, if that makes sense. So, Mike, am I understanding your question right, or?
I guess so. I'm just not sure. So you're kind of leading. So the participant might say, well, I don't drink 3 times a week. Yet they drank on that day because there was a huge event in Boston or Rhode Island. And is that different? You know, if you say, so if they say, okay, they drank 3 days a week, and then you say, well, what about on
I
this
see.
day?
Yeah, maybe I'm getting closer here. I feel like, so what we're trying to do with most of the methods that I just talked about is get very specific details about actual events that happen on specific days, if that makes sense. So we're less interested in one's typical behavior and more interested on what they actually did, what actually happened, if that makes sense. So in the case of timeline follow-back methods like these, that's actually a very good thing if we can prompt them to think about the event, right, that they went to, and that leads them to sort of be able to recall a bit better how much they drank. In the typical sort of drinking, the typical approach, we sort of very generally assess one's typical drinking over a long period of time, like by asking, how much do you generally drink over a given week, over this amount of time? That may be less helpful because you're really trying to get someone to, in general, sort of talk about how much they typically do something. That kind of speaks to the issues I was talking about when we're really trying to get precise about measuring how much alcohol someone used. Those very general approaches have the problem of requiring people to both recall and aggregate. So, and they're sort of thinking about like, okay, in a typical week, how much would I drink? Well, I went on spring break and there was a big spike then, how much does that mean? So they're doing a lot of work, and I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that with a lot of these internet facilitated methods, we can really hone in on what exactly happens, and we might want to do that in some cases.
Tyler, I think
Yeah.
you could actually answer that question with data, not right now, but
You
might, yeah, if you have a little break. Because I think the question would be, if you could compare your momentary assessment on a holiday to your momentary assessment on a regular day, and then compare them to the timeline follow-back, assuming that the timeline follow-back used the holiday as a prompt, and see if there's a differential reporting. I think that's what your point is, and I don't think we know the answer to your question.
Well, and that's a very specific issue. Yeah, we can move on here. So, but I would say too, that's actually one interesting question you could answer with this online timeline fallback too, because we're asking people first, kind of like the in-person method. We're asking people first about important days that happen, so you can sort of ask, okay, on days when they identified an important event, is their recall a bit better than it would be otherwise? So that's a great one. Okay, sorry.
So I think we'll probably deal with more questions after, because me and Kendall we want to tell you our measures, not our measures, the measures that we are presenting. So I'm Judy Hahn. I'm from UCSF. I am part of the Urban Arch, leading the Uganda cohort, and I'm happy to talk very briefly about alcohol biomarkers. Particularly PEF, which was just mentioned, and some other new developments. This is very superficial and brief, but I'm happy to answer questions
and talk in more depth because I actually can talk about this for hours, but I will not. Okay, so this is my favorite picture. I think I'm going to make that virus picture my wallpaper. So I'm going to talk a little bit, kind of coming up, alcohol use is hard to report, my vision of that. What are alcohol biomarkers? And I'll talk a little bit about PEth, and then some other markers, and maybe some that are on the horizon. Okay, so here's what we were just talking about, recall bias. I just thought this was kind of a cute picture. It's pretty hard to remember what you're drinking. And so, actually I want to step back a little bit, and I think that we have this thing going on in all these talks. Some of these measures of alcohol use are retrospective, right? What did you do? So the timeline follow back is what did you do? The audit is what did you do? The EMA is more prospective, what are you doing now? Biomarkers are going to be retrospective because it's something going on in your body. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. If you're seeing a patient in a clinic, you're not going to be able to, give them an EMA, but you might be able to ask them about their alcohol use or do some kind of biological test. So we have to think about these distinctions. That someone says, like, what's the best biomarker? What's the best measure? Well, it really is context specific of what you're measuring, what you're trying to get out of it. Okay, so we have recall bias. Actually, I left out aggregation bias, but that could be an important factor. We have drink size that can be very hard to estimate, especially if you're going to Hooverville and Soto in Seattle. This, I don't know, I Googled something like drink size, and this is what I got, so that was pretty awesome. So you could get a drink, there have been some studies in San Francisco in the Castro, you get twice as much alcohol in a drink. So even if you're counting your drinks, your standard drink may be much larger than you think. And the Alcohol Research Group in Emeryville, California does a lot of work with this. There's also drink sharing. How many drinks did you have? Well, I don't know. I was sharing a bottle of wine with a couple of friends. Or I was at a wedding and they kept on refilling my glass. Or I was in Africa and I was drinking from this communal drink called Mawa. Or I was on the street and we had a fifth, and I don't know how much I had. And then there's social desirability bias. So how many people think that this woman is going to tell these nice young researchers that she drinks a bottle of wine a night? But she might. How many people think she's going to say she drinks 2 glasses of wine a night? 1 glass of wine a night? I don't drink at all? So who knows? I mean, it's really challenging in many situations. Not all situations, but many situations. It's challenging for people to actually report how much they're drinking. I especially feel strongly about this when we're doing intervention trials that involve alcohol counseling. The participant has just gone through counseling. You just told them how bad this stuff is for them. Are they really going to report exactly what they've been drinking if they have been unable to reduce? And then again, this second context I think is important too, when there's a power dynamic, some kind of prestige or respect. I think it's challenging to give an accurate report of your drinking. Note that I didn't ask you guys how much you drank last night. Okay, so what about biologic markers? So biologic markers are useful in overcoming some of these challenges. There are different types of markers. One of them is just alcohol itself that we can measure in the blood or breath that we just demonstrated, or in sweat. And then there's what we call direct. The second bullet is the direct alcohol biomarkers, and they're byproducts of alcohol metabolism. Directly, when alcohol goes in your system, you metabolize it. There's some byproducts that are produced. One of them is phosphatidylethanol. Another one, what we call PEth. Another one, ethylglucuronide, abbreviated to ETG. There's other alcohol biomarkers that are usually measures of the harm that alcohol has caused. So these include liver enzymes, MCV. There's a whole variety of them. People are looking at maybe cytokines as measures of when alcohol is harming your system. You have these markers in your system. So some people are thinking of these as and using them as alcohol biomarkers as well. So I pointed out before that we have this sort of retrospective, prospective. So all these biomarkers are retrospective, right? They also have a varying they have varying windows of how much and how long they can detect the alcohol. So when you're choosing a biomarker, you need to be cognizant of what its window of detection is, because it's going to make a difference for what purpose you want to use it. Okay, so this is very general, but in my view, the advantage of biomarkers are definitely that they're objective measures. You can't really mess with a biomarker unless maybe you replace your urine in the bathroom. The direct biomarkers, because they're metabolites of alcohol use, have very high specificity, so you're not going to get many false positives. You shouldn't be getting false positives. Some of them are quantitative or semi-quantitative. You saw the Tyler's dose response curve there. The phosphatidyl ethanol goes up as the amount of alcohol consumed goes up. An interesting thing about the biomarkers too is biomarkers, as well as probably the direct as well as the indirect markers, they may also reflect physical harm. Because they're products of metabolizing alcohol, if you're a really good metabolizer, you might clear the biomarker and you might not have the harm. So in that way, they're sort of interesting for biological studies. And as I think Rich mentioned, they can also work as like a bogus pipeline where they give someone incentive or make them more likely to be better self-reporters. So in that way, biomarkers can be interesting, because then you could choose a biomarker that maybe isn't your favorite biomarker, but you might find a cheap one that's gonna, or less expensive one that's going to inspire better self-report. Because I'm not saying that we should use biomarkers in isolation, actually, and so this is a nice way to think about one use for biomarkers. There are some drawbacks. Most of them are not point of care. So an audit C is point of care. And you know, if a clinician wants to get a measure, they can do that, or some of the other screening tools right there. They do involve some sort of specimen collection, so they have some level of invasiveness. A lot of the issues with the current biomarkers is the sensitivity. There are false negatives. And that can be a little bit problematic if you're using the biomarker to provide feedback. Say you want to, show someone that they're drinking too much. You think they're drinking too much. You do the biomarker, and if the biomarker comes back negative, they're like, hey, I'm fine, or I didn't get caught. So that the lack of sensitivity in some of them can be problematic. They are affected because they're biological. They're affected by biologic variability. Like I said, people who metabolize alcohol faster would have different levels. And they seem, and as actually was pointed out earlier, just before, they kind of measure overall quantity of alcohol use over the time period. There is no biomarker yet that we know of that can separate binge drinking from chronic heavy drinking. 30 drinks is 30 drinks, as far as we know, in the biomarker world. Oops. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about my favorite biomarker, PEth. It's an abnormal phospholipid formed only in the presence of alcohol, so again, very specific. It has these homologs, 48 homologs. Really, most people are testing one or two of those, the most common ones. It's measured in whole blood or dry blood spots using liquid chromatography, tandem mass spectrometry. It's not cheap. And some research, it's at a commercial lab in the US, some research labs in the US, and some labs in Europe also do this test. And it reflects drinking over the prior 2 to 3 weeks. So it's kind of nice for research studies, because you don't want too short a biomarker, so that might not be representative over the time period. So it's at least a little longer than a few days, a few weeks usually. This is just to show you that the biomarker that PEth forms after you drink alcohol and then starts decaying. This is an example of an experiment where volunteers were given a few drinks every day for 5 days. You can see their PEth level rises, and then they stop drinking, and then it decays. Obviously, the more you drink, the higher it goes up and the longer it takes to come down. So it takes a longer time to become undetectable for the heavier drinkers. So how do we typically use PEth in our research studies? We can use it qualitatively with a yes/no. Over a variety of studies, It has shown sensitivity of at least more than 80% and specificity of more than 90%, but it depends on the period of observation that you're looking at. So if you want to look at any drinking over 3 months, that's not going to work because it's really only detected in the past few weeks. So when we do look at it dichotomously, we can actually use different cutoffs to represent different levels of drinking. These cutoffs are very much in flux. There needs to be more research on this. We are going to be working on that ourselves, but this is what we know so far. In general, people use, and it makes the studies support using the limit of quantification, which is usually 8 nanograms per ml as a cutoff for any drinking. For heavy drinking or unhealthy drinking, about 2 or 3 drinks daily would be somewhere in the range of 35 to 80. And then excessive drinking, that's a European term, is more than 5 drinks a day daily, and that's somewhere above 200 nanograms per ml. So that's kind of the range of cutoffs you'll see in the literature. You could also use it for quantitatively in studies correlating it with total grams of alcohol. PEP has had a correlation from 0.6, Spearman correlation of about 0.6 to 0.8. It's very curvilinear, so if you are going to use it quantitatively, you should be doing some kind of transformation. This is just an example of a study that used phosphatidylethanol in a contingency management trial. And what I think is interesting about that is you can see that the PEP really does seem to change as alcohol use changes. So in the first period, on the left, that white group is doing PEP tests every single week, but they're not giving any incentives for reducing their drinking. And you see their PEP levels are ranging from above, I think it's about 50, to actually it's way above 500 for some of them. This is actually only 5 people. But they have fairly high PEP levels. Then they're starting to get incentives for reducing their PEP level. And you can see that one person stayed a very heavy drinker, but several people did drop their drinking and their PEP levels dropped fairly dramatically. Still not undetectable, still quite high, but it did change quite a bit. And then when they take the incentive away, their PEP levels come back up again. So it's nice to see this, to just see how responsive it is to an intervention. That doesn't, it's doing what it says it's going to do. That in a few weeks it reduces if you reduce your drinking. Okay, now a quick tour of other biomarkers. Another biomarker that we're using in some of our research is ethylglucuronide. It can be found in urine, and in urine it can detect alcohol use over the prior 2 or 3 days. It's usually used qualitatively. It can be tested via a commercial laboratory. There's actually I left this on the slide, there's a desktop machine that some people buy for I think about $30,000 to $40,000, and there's also a dipstick, that's what's in the picture. And then we're using the dipstick in Uganda, in a study in Uganda. It can be useful to detect recent drinking. People are using it to detect relapse in treatment studies. Ethylglucuronide is also a direct metabolite that can be found in hair, and then it's a longer window of detection. But it can be affected by hair treatments, and there's a lot more variability and a little bit less, not that much research using hair, ETG and hair as biomarker, but it has been used. My feeling is when you start to look at these longer time frames, I think you get more noise and more variability and all these biological things that are going on that might be affecting your alcohol metabolism that are going to be amplified when you're trying to look in things like the slow growth of hair. And the same thing for nails. It can be detected in fingernails, and it's even a longer time period, but it's fairly problematic. Okay, here's just showing what we're finding from the ETG dipstick. Our results are actually not as strong as what we've seen in the literature, so it's helpful, but it's not detecting all the alcohol use that we think is happening by self-report. Okay, and then there's some other markers, and I'm being waved on, so I think I'm just going to refer you to the slides or to talk to me. I would just say that my last point on this slide is that combinations of markers can be useful, and combinations of markers and self-report can be useful. That's actually how, in my research studies, I usually use, if they're audit C positive and or PEF above say 50, then I consider them an unhealthy drinker. And that way maximize the specificity and increase the sensitivity. Okay, just a few future things. There are some papers out, and I've been in contact with the researchers in Sweden who are doing high throughput analyses for PET, so that could potentially lower the price. So far, they're only doing it on whole blood. I'm pushing them to figure out a way to do it on dried blood spots. There's also one little manuscript about doing PET in breath cartridges, and that little blue thing that looks like a grenade is actually a way to actually collect breath. So that's a little bit interesting. Haven't seen much action on that, but it's possible. Also, there are these sweat patches, which is more like a biosensor, I think, because again, it's more prospective. But you can measure ETG in sweat off one of these patches that are used to detect other drugs. So that's feasible. It hasn't really been done. And the last direction is proteomics, which is looking at all your proteins and trying to do some sophisticated analyses to see if any of them are associated with different drinking profiles. And there is some action on that, so maybe we'll see something come out of that. And that is all.
I'm going to be the closer.
Oh, I have to do this. I was encouraging her to go as long as possible. So
I know, you're like
just say anything.
opposite hand waving.
All right. Well, while they're putting up my slides, I can make jokes about the other talks. No, I won't do that. The first one is that Bob Cook, who doesn't like PET, is stuck in an airport. So he hasn't come here to criticize PET. The other one is I wrote all the original criteria for DSM-3R and DSM-4 and validated them. It was basically a big fight between the psychiatrist and the psychologist, because the psychologist knew how to validate everything, and the psychiatrist wanted withdrawal and tolerance as the only criteria. So all the things that Rich said are, I looked at them and I go, oh God, they're still talking about this. That was 30 years ago. Okay, so I was given the assignment, which I worked on this morning and a little bit last night, while the ambulances were going by, to talk about new tools for assessment of alcohol use in the context of HIV. And there were two perfectly good, brilliant talks that I have that were sent to me that were wonderful talks. Tom Gentry gave one of them, and Kathy Young gave the other one, which I've completely ignored. So you get my talk. Okay. So the issue is, will biosensors save us? And obviously what we see are things like things for diabetes. So we have these A1C monitors. I'm sorry, not A1C, but blood glucose levels that are being advertised on TV. You stick something in, you run your little, sensor over it, and now you know what your blood glucose level is. And most people lower their blood glucose level by about 10%, actually, by just having these self-monitors. So there's a lot of hope for these alcohol biosensors. So how do I move forward is the question. Is it just, which one do I push? I push it. Okay. Now, this is the wire. This may be my only slide since we're over time. If you can come up with a really good wearable alcohol biosensor, you get $200,000. That's the end of my talk. But that actual hand there was designed by my daughter, who works in communications for NIAAA, and there was a competition for coming up with these things. So can you create a wearable alcohol biosensor? So keep going. There have been some, like the University of Florida had one that didn't quite work out, but there are a whole bunch out there. But there are ones that have, let's see, that was 2015, so you're only 4 years behind here. Okay, come on, down. Okay, all I'm going to say is, so what are you trying to create a biosensor for? There are many different outcomes for HIV/AIDS. I'm not going to go through them, but obviously you could try to look at all sorts of things, and obviously there are all these important outcomes, which I will skip over quickly. But these are things that are important in terms of what you would want to relate these sort of findings from your biosensors to. So some of the biosensors would be specifically focused on alcohol. And what we know is that when you use large samples and big data, that as we've already seen, that all of these measures of alcohol, as you have HIV, it gets a lot worse when your audit C is higher, or you drink more per month, or whether you have heavy episodic drinking. So there are a lot of reasons for having these that are related to alcohol. And obviously, if you could combine the alcohol with some other things, this is Shirish Barbe and that other guy in the back who's not paying any attention. Yeah, okay. But this is some microbial translocation. So a lot of this would be, here are all the other things you might want to look at with a biosensor of some sort. And NIH is actually trying to develop these things. So there is the actual alcohol biosensor, but they're actually trying to develop biosensor shirts and things like that that can actually sample all sorts of things. Cardiovascular, your heart rate, things like that. So in the future, you just put this on, all the data goes to your doctor, they prescribe all the right drugs, you come home, and that's it. Okay. So, and of course, the main metaphor in HIV care is the care continuum. So the big question is, how could your biosensor help us with the care continuum? Could we, and we know that as you drink more, bad things happen, you aren't really going to stay on virally suppressed. So biosensors might allow you to do things like look at your drinking levels, but also look at your, let's say, your HIV viral loads. You could combine this with other things. So they really aren't supposed to operate separately. And as we know from a lot of these blood tests, you want to get a lot of things. You don't want to just measure one thing, you want to measure a bunch of things. Like if you're virally suppressed, maybe your inflammation has gone up. So maybe you need to measure those kinds of things. So what's a good wearable biosensor? What should it do? Well, obviously we should be able to monitor your BAC, we should be able to do real-time detection, it should be relatively passive sampling, it should be non-invasive, so we don't have to draw blood. It should be wearable, comfortable, affordable, inconspicuous, and highly fashionable, and developed by Under Armour. Yeah, and then all the athletes would wear them, right? Okay, so we want ability to transmit, and so from a kind of getting data point of view, you want to be able to transmit, interpret, and record data, give that to your care provider. It should be standardized. There should be a dependable power source, so you don't have to plug yourself into the wall every 5 minutes. It's like recharging your phone. It has to be miniaturized. You should be able to move around with it actively so it doesn't fall off. And it should allow things like GPS, so it would know when you're in a bar, and it could do other things like make sure it's really you. So things like the ankle monitors make sure they're really you. So you can't get them off, and that's what data security is. So these things do exist, and some very famous people have used these. Does anyone know who that woman is? That's Lindsay Lohan, right? So basically what it is that, you know, the ankle monitors have been used for a long time by legal systems. They're trying to deal with DUI. They're trying to basically make sure you're not drinking and that you don't leave certain vicinities. But we have the Backtrack Sync. This is the leading one that's out there. And we have sort of an argument that it should be used for around auto accidents and you know, so you can read sort of the ad here. I can't really advertise this legally, so you know it's. But you can see that Backtrack really loves you. But they're going to put it on your cell phone. We have heard a lot about how cell phones are going to be used, and these things will give you all sorts of profiles and information. Okay. And you can build in other information, whether you're moving or not moving. So if you're just sitting at a bar and drinking, you could be very sedentary. Okay, so I'm gonna just tell you, here's the pharmacokinetics. It's not quite the blood alcohol level that you would see in other tests, but it does allow you to pick up your blood alcohol level. There's a delay, I think, of what is it, there's a certain temporal delay. I thought it was about 20 minutes. Okay, so here's a whole bunch of nice papers you can go and read on the different validation issues, particularly with different genders. And of course, it's actually being used. Believe it or not, in Florida, we're already using some of these things. So in the study, which Bob Cook is not here for, we're actually using it with contingency management to try to get people down to non-drinking and then see what kinds of cognitive outcomes are associated with recovery. We won't go into all that. Now, the main thing here is that where would you use these? So primary care providers turn out to be notoriously bad at detecting whether you have an alcohol use disorder. This is from a large-scale study through the Veterans Aging Cohort. And basically what it turns out, if you look at all the other providers, they're the ones that pick up your alcohol use disorders. It's probably because of liver malfunction, things like that. But clearly you could overcome some of these problems. And so the benefits to the treatment provider would allow it feedback from treatment professionals, much more of an accurate picture of progress being made. You can compile records, allow for appropriate treatment, possibly timely intervention with the wearer. We could use it that way. But clearly we need to improve our treatment. And I'm not going to go through this, but this shows you how bad our actual delivery of alcohol treatment is for both HIV and non-HIV. It's always worse for the HIV patients. All right, and we have the okay, so you'll see that they don't get injectables, et cetera, et cetera. It's Rich Sates in the room.
Right here.
All right, so this is just basically Rich Sates' major point. We have a really wonderful paper coming out in Lancet on step trials, but obviously this is using them in adaptive care settings might be a great place to use them. So how do you get someone from one step to another? When should you move them from one step? Or should you reduce them from one step to another? And this will be in Lancet in a week or two. It's kind of interesting paper. So finally, what I'm going to say is there's an analytic challenge here. Have all our data analysts left the room? Not quite. But analyzing this complex data that's temporally anchored is extremely difficult. There are, we've already heard mentioned, machine learning, other profile analysis protocols. I think they're very important. Can we use these new tools in the context of electronic medical records, e-health, other biomarkers like phosphatidylethanol in combination with self-assessments, okay? And should we develop analytic and decision models for characterizing comorbidities relative to the use of these types of new adaptive designs? And these include algorithmic approaches. And we are actually starting to do this at Johns Hopkins. And I think this all brings us to implementation research and how this might move us along. And so they're the people you should talk to if you want a grant or to get that $200,000. So just call them up. We still have some money, you know, and we might give you a little bit of that. Okay, thank you very much.
That wraps it up. I want to thank everybody who did the presentations, and you know who to talk to if you want more details about it. Thanks, guys.